I picked the Alvord Desert because nobody else would be there. That was the whole point. 3 years of noise, open floor plan office, roommate's TV through the wall, my phone buzzing with notifications I never asked for, and I wanted one weekend where the only sound was wind. I pitched my tent at the edge of the playa, that flat white expanse of cracked earth stretching to the horizon like the surface of the moon. No trees, no rocks, nothing to break the sight line. You could see a person coming from 2 miles off. That was supposed to be the appeal. Total visibility, total solitude, nothing hiding. The first night was perfect. I sat outside with instant coffee going cold in my hands and watched more stars than I knew existed. I fell asleep around 11, lulled by absolute silence. I woke up at 2 a.m. because I heard footsteps. Not close, far off, but distinct. That specific crunch of boots on hardpan, evenly spaced, unhurried. I lay still and listened, telling myself it was some rock settling, thermal contraction, the desert doing what deserts do at night. But rocks don't have rhythm. This had rhythm. 4 steps, pause, 4 steps, pause, like someone counting. I unzipped the tent flap an inch and looked out. Under a fat gibbous moon, the playa was silver white and I could see for what felt like a mile in every direction. Nothing. No shape, no movement. Nothing but flat ground all the way to where the mountains cut the sky. I told myself the sound had traveled from somewhere far off. Sound does strange things on a hardpan flat. Bounces and carries. I zipped the flap and lay back down, heart doing something I didn't like. The footsteps started again 10 minutes later. Closer. I did the math nobody wants to do at 2 a.m. alone. If someone was out there and I could see nothing, that meant they were behind me, on the side of the tent with no window. I turned my headlamp on, low red mode, and sat with my knife, the small one I used for cutting rope, in my lap, feeling stupid and terrified in equal measure. The steps stopped maybe 30 feet away. I know it was 30 because I'd walked that distance earlier that day to bury my trash, and I remembered how long it took. Then nothing. 15 minutes of nothing. My legs cramped from sitting rigid. Eventually I convinced myself it had moved on. Whatever it was, coyote maybe, or my imagination doing what imaginations do in that much silence. I didn't sleep again that night. In the morning I checked the ground on that side of the tent. Windswept hardpan doesn't hold prints well, but there was a suggestion of something. Depressions, maybe boot-shaped, maybe not, arranged in a line that stopped exactly where the sound had stopped. I photographed it, told myself it was nothing, and spent the day hiking to burn off nervous energy, half hoping to run into another camper just to hear a human voice that wasn't mine. I didn't see anyone. Not one soul, not one dust trail on the horizon, not one distant tent. I had genuinely never felt so alone, and for the first time all trip, alone stopped feeling like relief and started feeling like exposure. That night I moved my tent closer to my truck, some animal logic that metal meant safety. I left the headlamp on inside, a stupid beacon, but I needed to see the fabric walls and know nothing was pressing against them. The footsteps came back at 1:40 a.m. This time they didn't stop at 30 feet. They came to 10, then 5. I stopped breathing. I could hear, or thought I could hear, a kind of low exhale between each set of steps, patient, almost bored. Then, right outside the tent wall, close enough that the fabric should have shown a shadow if the moon was behind it, which it was, the steps simply stopped, and there was no shadow at all, nothing blocking the light. Just the sound, sourceless, 3 feet from my head, and then silence so complete I could hear my own pulse in my ears. I didn't move until sunrise. When I finally unzipped the tent, the light was already high and ordinary, and the desert looked exactly like a photograph of itself, empty and indifferent. There were no prints this time, none. Not even mine from walking there the day before. The wind had erased everything, smoothed the whole playa back into blankness, like a page wiped clean for something else to write on it. I packed up in 11 minutes, a personal record, and didn't look back at the empty flat until I was on pavement again with the radio on, too loud, on purpose. I haven't been back, but sometimes, in my apartment at 2 a.m., in the gap between the traffic outside and the hum of the fridge, I hear 4 steps and a pause, and I have to remind myself there's carpet under my feet and walls around me, and nowhere for the sound to come from at all. My name's Derek, I'm 31, and I do IT support for a school district in Pueblo, Colorado. Last October, I decided to try something I'd been putting off for 2 years. Solo camping, no cell signal, no marked trail. I picked the backcountry area past the dune field at Great Sand Dunes National Park, about 4 miles past Sand Creek. I checked out at the visitor center at 2:40 in the afternoon, told the ranger where I'd be, and drove my Jeep Cherokee to the trailhead lot by 3:15. I had a 2-person REI half-dome tent, a Coleman single-burner stove, 6 liters of water in 2 Nalgene bottles, and a bladder, and a paper permit clipped to my pack. I picked a flat spot in a bowl between 2 dunes, maybe 300 yards from the nearest ridge, where the sand was packed down enough to stake the tent properly. Got there around 5:30, had the tent up by 6, ate a dehydrated pad thai while the sun went down, and was asleep by 9. I woke up around 6 the next morning to a cold tent and the sound of nothing. That's one thing about the dunes, there's no wind noise like you'd expect, no rustling, just quiet. I unzipped the fly to get some air moving and noticed a second set of footprints circling my tent, not mine. Mine were the ones I'd made walking in, still visible from the ridge to the campsite. These were smaller, bare feet, and they went in a loop around the tent, maybe 6 or 7 feet out, then just stopped. No trail leading up to them, no trail leading away, like whoever made them had been dropped there and picked back up. I figured it was some other camper who'd wandered off from a group site further out, seen my tent, gotten curious, and walked a loop around it before heading back. Dune sand shifts fast in the wind, so a trail leading away could have been wiped out overnight if the wind had picked up around dawn. I didn't hear the wind, but I'd been asleep. It made sense enough. I ate breakfast, filled my water bottles from what I'd packed in, and decided to stay a second night since the permit covered it. That second night, I didn't sleep well. Around 1 in the morning, I heard something outside. Not footsteps exactly, more like a dragging sound, slow, moving past the tent from one side to the other. I lay still and listened until it stopped. I told myself it was probably a kit fox or a badger, something dragging a kill, or just moving low through the sand. The dunes have wildlife. I'd seen fox tracks the day before. When I checked in the morning, the footprints were back. Same bare feet, same size, but this time the loop was tighter, maybe 3 feet from the tent instead of 6 or 7, and there was a second loop crossing over the first, like whoever it was had circled twice. That's when I stopped explaining it to myself. Foxes don't leave bare human footprints, and nobody walks a tight loop around a stranger's tent twice at 1 a.m. without a reason. I packed up right then, before I'd even eaten, and started making my way back toward the trailhead, keeping to the ridgelines so I could see a distance in every direction. About halfway back, maybe a mile and a half out, I saw someone standing at the top of a dune off to my left, maybe 80 yards away, just standing there, not moving, facing my direction. A man, I think, though it was hard to tell at that distance, thin, wearing what looked like a dark long-sleeve shirt, no pack, no hat, bare feet in the sand even though the surface temperature out there gets brutal by mid-morning. He didn't wave, he didn't call out, he just stood there and watched me walk. I didn't stop to get a better look. I put my head down and kept moving toward the lot, checking over my shoulder every few minutes. Each time I looked, he was still there, in the same spot, until the last time I checked and he wasn't. I never saw him come down off that dune in either direction. I got to my Jeep, threw my pack in the back, and drove straight to the visitor center. Told the ranger on duty what I'd seen. She took my name and wrote it up, said they'd note it for the backcountry patrol, and asked if I'd seen any other campers register for that section. I hadn't. According to the sign-in sheet at the trailhead, no one else had checked into that part of the dune field in 9 days. I never went back. But about 4 months later, I was reading a local news site out of Alamosa and saw a short piece about a body recovered from a wash near the dunes, weeks after the fact, decomposed enough that they couldn't immediately confirm how long it had been out there. The article didn't give a name or say where exactly, just in the vicinity of the dune field. I never found a follow-up story after that. I was 41, divorced 8 months, and camping alone in the Anza Borrego Badlands because my therapist suggested I sit with discomfort instead of running from it. I don't think she meant literal desert. I'd always wanted to see the Badlands at night, so I packed the truck and told my sister I'd check in by satellite messenger every evening, which felt responsible and adult, the kind of thing a person who has her life together would do. I found a spot 2 miles off the main track, down a wash with good sight lines, no cell signal, nobody around for what the map suggested was at least 6 miles in any direction. I liked that number. 6 miles felt like enough insulation from every conversation I didn't want to have anymore. The land there is marked with old fence lines, remnants from ranching operations that gave up decades ago, rotted posts, sagging wire, sometimes just a line of post holes where the wood had finally lost the argument with time. My sight happened to sit near one of these lines, maybe 40 yards off, running arrow straight into the Badlands until it vanished over a rise. I noticed it the first afternoon and didn't think much of it. By the second evening, I'd started noticing that it didn't look quite the same each time I looked. Not dramatically. A post I remembered leaning left now looked upright. A section of wire I thought was slack looked taut. I told myself I was misremembering, that anxious brains do this, invent small discrepancies to have something to chew on. That night, I sent my check-in message and sat by my camp stove, eating rehydrated chili, and I watched the fence line the way you watch a door you're not sure you locked. Around 9, a post moved. Not blown, moved. A slow, deliberate lean, the kind of motion wind doesn't produce, more like something settling its weight against old wood from the other side. I stood up fast enough to knock my bowl over. I watched a long 5 minutes. Nothing else happened. I told myself it was a coyote brushing against it, or the ground shifting, and I made myself sit back down, because the alternative was admitting I was frightened of a fence. I didn't sleep much. Around midnight, I heard the wire hum, that particular metallic thrum old fence wire makes when something touches it and lets go, once. Then again, 10 minutes later, further down the line. Like someone walking the fence, hand trailing along the top wire, checking it the way a rancher might check for brakes. I am not an outdoorsy person by instinct. I grew up in the Sacramento suburbs and came to this trip through willpower, not comfort. So when I say I made myself get out of the tent and shine my light at the fence, I want you to understand what that cost me. My light found nothing, just wire and leaning posts and the pale ground beyond, stretching off into dark. But the humming didn't stop when the light hit it. It continued, methodical, moving away from me down the line, post to post, like my light meant nothing at all to whatever was causing it. I got back in the tent and didn't come out again that night. I lay there running the ranching history through my head, trying to make it mundane. Cattle used to lean on fences, maybe some animals still did, out of habit, out of memory of a use the land didn't have anymore. It didn't help. The wire kept humming at intervals until almost 3 a.m., always moving, always along that same line, like a patrol. In the morning I walked out to the fence, because staying scared felt worse than confirming what I was scared of. The posts were exactly as weathered and ordinary as they'd looked on day one. At the base of each one, in the soft dirt, there was a mark, not a footprint, not a paw print, just a shallow crescent, repeated post to post, all the way down the line until it crested the rise and I lost the nerve to keep following it. I broke camp that morning, earlier than planned. Driving out, I passed the fence line one more time from the truck, and for just a second, in the side mirror, I could have sworn every post was leaning the same direction, uniformly, like they'd all just let go of something at once. I called my sister from the trailhead, not the satellite messenger, an actual phone call. The first time in 8 months I'd wanted to hear a voice, more than I wanted to be alone with my thoughts. She asked how the trip was. I told her it was quiet. That felt like the only honest word I had for it. I'm 27, and last October I was driving from Phoenix to Vegas for a job interview. Money was tight. I'd just gotten laid off from my logistics job in July, and hotel prices along I-93 were running me almost $140 a night. So when I saw a stretch of BLM land off a dirt access road near the dunes outside Kingman, I figured I'd save myself 2 nights of hotel costs and just camp. I had a 2-person REI tent, a Coleman propane stove, a sleeping bag rated for 20 degrees, and a Nissan Altima that was not built for the terrain I ended up driving it on. I got to the site around 5 p.m., set up camp maybe half a mile off the road, far enough that I couldn't see any headlights. I laid everything out the way I always do: stove to the left of the tent entrance, cooler in front, boots outside the flap, headlamp hanging from the loop inside so I could find it in the dark. I've camped enough times to have a system. I made some rice and beans, watched the sun go down over the dunes, and crawled into the tent around 9:30. I woke up a little after 7 the next morning, and the first thing I noticed was my boots. I always leave them right outside the tent flap, laces loose, toes pointed toward the tent so I can just slide my feet in. That morning they were about 4 feet away, lined up neatly side by side, pointed away from the tent instead. I stood there for a second just looking at them. My first thought was the wind. It gets strange out in the dunes at night, gusts that come out of nowhere and die just as fast. I figured a gust must have caught them and tumbled them that direction, and the lined up neatly part was just me pattern matching on nothing, seeing order where there wasn't any. I've done that before. You stare at something long enough in the desert light, and your brain fills in shapes. I shrugged it off, made coffee, went for a hike to a ridge about a mile out to get a look at the dunes in the morning light. It took maybe 2 hours round trip. When I got back, the cooler was open. Not knocked over, open, lid resting against the side. The stove had been moved from the left side of the entrance to directly in front of it, centered, like someone had squared it up on purpose. I remember standing there running through it logically. Coyotes. It had to be coyotes. They're smart. They go after coolers all the time, and maybe one had nosed the lid open and knocked the stove in the process. I checked inside the cooler. Nothing was missing. Nothing was chewed on. No paw prints in the sand around it, which struck me as odd, but the ground right there was harder packed, wind scoured, so I told myself tracks just hadn't taken. Moved the stove back, closed the cooler, and told myself I was being paranoid because I was out there alone for the first time. That night I made sure to zip everything into the tent with me: stove, boots, everything except the cooler, which I weighed down with a rock. I didn't sleep well. Around 2 a.m. I woke up to a scraping sound outside, low and dragging, like something heavy being pulled across sand. I lay there and listened to it for almost a full minute before it stopped. I told myself it was the cooler shifting, or a rock working loose on the slope behind me. I did not go outside to check. I want to be honest about that. I just lay there with my headlamp gripped in my hand until it got quiet, and eventually I fell back asleep out of exhaustion more than comfort. When I woke up the second time, before dawn, everything inside the tent had been rearranged. My backpack, which I'd left by my feet, was up by my head. My boots, which I had zipped inside with me, were sitting outside the tent again, same as before, lined up and pointed away. And my headlamp, the one I'd fallen asleep gripping in my hand, was gone from my hand and sitting on top of my folded jacket a few feet away, switched off. That's when I stopped rationalizing. I unzipped the tent flap slowly and looked out. About 30 feet away, at the edge of where my headlamp beam reached, there was a man standing perfectly still, not crouched, not moving toward me, just standing, facing the tent. He looked to be in his 50s, thin, wearing a flannel shirt buttoned all the way up despite the heat, and jeans that looked too big for him, cinched with what looked like a length of rope instead of a belt. He had no bag, no light, no vehicle that I could see or hear. His hands were at his sides. He didn't say anything. He didn't move. He was just watching the tent the way you'd watch a TV left on in another room. I didn't think so. I grabbed my keys and my phone, left the boots, left the stove, left everything else, and ran for the car in my socks. I heard nothing behind me. No footsteps, no voice, but I didn't look back to check. I got in, locked the doors, and got the Altima moving down that dirt road faster than it had any business going, fishtailing twice before I hit pavement. I called the Mojave County Sheriff's non-emergency line once I had a signal, and they took a report but told me it was BLM land, hard to patrol, and that transients did sometimes camp out there. I never went back for my gear. About 4 months later, out of curiosity, I looked up news from that stretch of road for anything from around that time. There was a short article from a Kingman paper about human remains found by hikers in the dunes off that same access road, roughly 2 miles from where I'd camped. The body had been out there, according to the coroner's estimate, for at least 6 months before it was found, which would put the time of death well before I was ever out there. They never released a name. I work night shifts at a hospital, so my body clock runs backwards from most people's, which is the only reason I even considered winter camping in Death Valley. I figured the cold, empty off-season would suit someone who already lives on the far side of normal hours. Late January. Nobody in their right mind camps there in January, except the type of person who finds a near-empty park appealing rather than alarming. That was me. I checked in at the ranger station before heading out, a formality more than anything, since the ranger, a tired-looking guy in his 50s named Holt, barely glanced up from his paperwork. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that I should sign the trail register at the primitive site marker for tracking and to log my return the same way. I found the register bolted to a post at the edge of a dry wash, a battered spiral notebook in a metal box, half its pages swollen with old moisture. I signed my name, date, intended stay, 2 nights. Above my entry were maybe a dozen others going back months, mostly names and dates, a few notes like beautiful hike or wind was brutal. Nothing unusual. I didn't think about it again until the first night. I set up camp in a wide open bowl ringed by low hills, chosen specifically because I could see the register post from my tent. Some instinct told me I wanted a landmark, something fixed in a landscape that otherwise looked identical in every direction. The cold that night was sharp and clean, the kind that makes stars look closer than they should, and I fell asleep reading with a headlamp, feeling more peaceful than I had in months. I woke at some point past midnight to a sound like pages turning. Rhythmic, patient, coming from outside, from the direction of the post. I told myself it was wind moving through the notebook, an easy explanation, plausible enough. I almost believed it until I remembered I'd latched the metal box shut myself, snapped the little clasp closed after signing in. Wind doesn't unlatch things. I unzipped the tent enough to look. The moon was 3/4 and the bowl was bright as dusk. I could see the post clearly, 60 yards off. The box was open, its lid tilted back, and pages were turning. One pause, with nobody standing there. No shape, no shadow, no wind that I could feel at all against my own face. I stayed frozen at the tent flap for what felt like 20 minutes, watching pages turn themselves in dead still air, until eventually the motion stopped and the bowl went back to looking like an ordinary moonlit nowhere. I didn't go check it that night, I'm not that brave, but I also didn't sleep, and somewhere in the small hours I started running through the logical possibilities the way you do when your mind refuses silence. A hinge issue, some pressure differential from temperature drop, anything. None of them explained why the box had been latched. At first light, I walked to the post, half convinced I'd find a mundane explanation waiting to embarrass me. The box was closed again, clasp fastened, exactly as I'd left it. I opened it and paged back through the register, and near the bottom, in the entries from the past few months, I found something that stopped me cold. 3 different names, 3 different dates, each with the same handwritten note beside their check-in. Heard the pages, didn't sleep. Different handwriting each time. Different ink. Nobody had checked out on any of those 3 entries. No return date filled in. I hiked out that morning, a day early, telling myself it was the cold, not fear, driving the decision, though I knew that wasn't true. At the ranger station, I told Holt about the pages, feeling foolish even as I said it. He didn't laugh, he just asked which post, and when I described the bowl, he nodded slowly and said the box had been replaced twice because people kept reporting the same thing, always in winter, always solo campers. He said park records showed the original register from decades back belonged to a backcountry ranger who went missing on a January patrol and was never found. His body, or his final logbook. He didn't offer any more than that, and I didn't ask. I signed out, made my return official, and drove home replaying the sound of those pages turning in perfectly still air, over and over, all the way to the highway lights. I'm 34. I work as a QA analyst for a software company in Riverside, and my girlfriend Dana likes to joke that the only thing I care about more than finding bugs in code is finding stars in the sky. That August, the Perseids were peaking on the night of the 12th, and I'd been planning the trip for 2 months. Kelso Dunes, out in the Mojave National Preserve, because it's one of the last true dark sky spots within a few hours of home. I packed my Celestron telescope, my Nikon D850 with an intervalometer for time-lapse shots, a 2-person tent, and enough water for 3 days, even though I only planned to stay 2 nights. I got to the dunes around 4 p.m., hiked in about a mile from the parking area to get clear of any ambient light, and set up camp on a flat stretch just past the first ridge of sand. I built a small fire that evening, more for the psychological comfort of it than anything. It gets down into the 50s out there even in August, and cooked a can of chili over it before letting it die down. Around 9:30, once it was fully dark, I doused it properly. Poured almost a full liter of water on it, stirred the coals with a stick, poured a second round, and watched until there was nothing but wet black char. I know how to put out a fire. I've been doing this since I was a kid in Boy Scouts. I set up my camera on the tripod, dialed in my settings, and lay back on a blanket to watch for meteors. Maybe 40 minutes in, I glanced over toward the fire pit out of habit and saw a small flame. Not a glow, an actual flame, maybe 2 inches high, flickering right at the center of the pit. My first thought was that I hadn't gotten it out as well as I thought. Desert wood can hold embers a long time, and if a coal was still hot under the wet char, a gust of wind could have exposed it and caught a dry twig. It wasn't windy that I could feel, but wind does strange things moving through dune fields. It channels along the ridgelines even when the air feels still at ground level. I got up, walked over, and doused it again, this time using almost all my remaining water and shoveling sand on top for good measure. I went back to my blanket and told myself that was the end of it. At 11:52, I remember, because I checked my phone right after, I heard a crackling sound, not small this time. I turned and the fire was fully going again, flames 1.5 feet high, throwing orange light across the sand and up onto the side of my tent. I could hear the wood popping. There was no way coal did that. There was no wood left unburned that I hadn't already used, and I certainly hadn't gathered more. I got up and walked toward it slowly. My heart was going by then, thudding hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. The fire pit itself looked wrong up close, deeper than the shallow scoop I dug that afternoon, with a blackened rim like it had been used for years, layers of old ash packed into the sand around the edges. I hadn't dug that. I'd made a pit maybe 4 inches deep. This one looked closer to a foot, with charcoal compacted in rings like sediment. I grabbed my empty water jug and ran to fill it from my last reserve bottle, came back, and dumped everything I had left onto the flames along with 2 full boots worth of sand, stomping it down with my hiking boots until my ankles ached. I stood over it for a long time after watching. Nothing. No smoke, no glow. I told myself it was over and started walking back toward my blanket. That's when I saw him. A man was crouched at the edge of my camp, maybe 15 feet from the pit, facing away from me toward the dark shape of the dunes. He was older, gray stubble, wearing a canvas jacket that looked heavy for the weather. He had both hands cupped low near the ground in front of him, like he was shielding something small. A lighter, a match, I couldn't tell. He didn't turn around. He didn't seem to register that I was standing there at all, even though I hadn't been quiet. I didn't wait to find out what he was doing. I grabbed my camera off the tripod, left the telescope where it sat, and half ran, half stumbled the mile back to the parking lot in the dark, using my phone flashlight to keep from twisting an ankle in the sand. I got in my car, locked the doors, and drove straight to the ranger station near the preserve entrance, even though it was closed for the night. I sat in the lot with the engine running until sunrise, then went in when a ranger arrived around 6:30 and told her what happened. She didn't seem shocked. She pulled out a binder and told me that section of the dunes had an old fire scar in the historical record, a controlled burn from decades back that had gotten away from a park employee and killed him out there, and that hikers occasionally reported smelling smoke or seeing firelight in that exact area with no fire permits on file and no other campers registered that week. She said it matter-of-factly, like she'd had this conversation before, and then asked if I wanted a ranger escort to go back for my telescope. I said no. I never went back for it. When I looked up the employee's name later out of curiosity, one photo from an old preserved newsletter showed him in a canvas jacket, crouched by a fire pit, cupping his hands to light it. I brought my dog originally. Rosie, a 12-year-old shepherd mix, had come camping with me a dozen times. This trip to the Mojave was supposed to be routine, 3 days, a stretch of BLM land near an old mining road, nothing technical. I mention her because what happened only makes sense in the shape of her absence, and because for the first 18 hours, everything was completely normal, which matters. I want you to know I'm not someone who sees things. I run a small landscaping business. I am, by every account, a boring and literal person. Rosie got spooked the first evening, badly, in a way I'd never seen. She wouldn't settle, kept pacing the perimeter of camp with her hackles up, growling at nothing I could identify, just open desert, scrub brush, the mining road curving off toward some low hills. Around 9 p.m. she bolted, just took off into the dark, ignoring every command, ignoring the whistle she'd never once ignored in a decade. I spent 2 hours searching with a flashlight, calling until my voice gave out, and eventually had to accept I wasn't finding her that night. That's when I noticed the tracks. Paw prints, hers, running from camp toward the hills, deep, panicked strides, the kind a dog makes at a dead sprint. And alongside them, matching stride for stride, a second set of prints I couldn't place. Not paw prints, not boots either. Long and narrow, with an oddly even, dragging quality to them, like something had been moving in a way that wasn't quite walking and wasn't quite anything I had a word for. They ran parallel to Rosie's tracks the entire distance I could follow them, maybe 80 yards, until the ground turned to hardpan and lost them both. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up with a knife and the flashlight, telling myself the second tracks belonged to a coyote, even though coyotes don't leave prints like that, even though the stride length didn't match any four-legged animal I could think of. Rosie came back the next morning, just walked into camp around dawn, unharmed, silent, in a way that was somehow worse than if she'd been hurt. No tail wag, no relief, just a flat, watchful stillness I'd never seen in her before. She wouldn't eat. She sat facing the hills for most of the day, ears up, and flinched every time I tried to touch her head. I should have left then. I told myself one more night wouldn't matter, that I'd invested the gas money and the days off work, that I was being irrational. I want to be honest about that decision, because I think it's the part of the story that actually matters. Not what happened next, but the ordinary small stubbornness that kept me there. That second night, Rosie wouldn't come in the tent. She lay outside the entrance, rigid, staring at the same stretch of hills. Around 2 a.m., I heard the dragging sound myself for the first time. A slow, uneven rhythm, moving somewhere out past the firelight, not approaching, not retreating, just present, circling at a distance I couldn't judge. Rosie didn't bark. That was the detail that frightened me most. A dog who barks at delivery trucks and vacuum cleaners lay completely silent, every muscle locked, watching something move in the dark that she had decided, with more certainty than I've ever seen in an animal, not to challenge. The sound continued, unhurried, for nearly an hour, before it simply stopped. Not faded, stopped. The way a sound stops when whatever makes it decides it's finished. Rosie didn't relax until the sky turned gray. I broke camp before the sun was fully up. Walking back to the truck, I passed the spot where the 2 sets of tracks had run parallel 2 nights before. The wind had worked on them, softened the edges, but they were still there, still visible enough to count strides. Hers stayed consistent the whole way. The other set never faltered either, never sped up or slowed to match her panic. An even, patient pace the entire distance, like whatever left it had never once needed to hurry. Rosie lived another 2 years after that trip, gentle and ordinary in every way except one. She never again let me take her camping, and to this day I don't know if that was her decision or a promise I made without meaning to. I was 24 and it was my first solo trip, which is probably why I ignored the one piece of advice everyone gave me: stick to marked trails. I'd hiked into a stretch of the Sonoran backcountry outside Ajo, following a numbered marker trail that the BLM map showed clearly. 14 posts between the trailhead and a scenic overlook. Easy to follow, hard to get lost on. That was the appeal. I wanted independence without genuine risk, training wheels for the real solo trips I imagined myself taking later. I made camp near Marker 9, a comfortable 2-mile hike in, and spent the first day proud of myself in a way that now embarrasses me a little. Proud of cooking my own food, reading the terrain, feeling capable. That pride is relevant because it's the thing that made me careless. On the second afternoon, I decided to hike ahead to Marker 14 and back before dark, just to see the overlook. I left most of my gear at camp, brought only water and my phone, no map, because I'd already memorized the route. 14 posts. How difficult could it be? I reached Marker 14 with plenty of light left, took some photos of a view that genuinely was extraordinary, folded ridgelines going purple in the distance, and started back. That's when I noticed Marker 13 wasn't where I remembered it. I want to be precise about what I mean. I'm not saying I got turned around, though I did, eventually. I mean that on my way out, Marker 13 had stood on my left, and on my way back, following what I was certain was the same trail, it now stood on my right, and past it, where Marker 12 should have been, there was nothing but open scrub in 3 directions and no post at all. I told myself I drifted off trail without noticing and backtracked to 13, then tried again, more carefully this time, counting my steps, watching the ground for the packed earth of the actual trail versus the looser sand around it. I found what I was sure was the trail. I followed it for what should have been the distance to Marker 12. No marker appeared. The land had gone unfamiliar in a way that made my stomach drop. Not dramatically different, just subtly wrong, angles slightly off from what I remembered, like a photograph of the right place taken from the wrong distance. The sun was maybe 2 hours from setting. I made the decision every guide tells you to make, and every panicking person struggles to make. Stop. Don't wander further. Think. I sat on a rock near Marker 13. I could still see it, at least, something fixed, and tried to reason it out. GPS on my phone showed a dot in the right general area, but no trail overlay, no signal for anything more detailed. I hadn't packed for this. I had maybe a liter of water and no light beyond my phone's flashlight. That's when I heard someone say my name. Not shouted, said conversationally, close by, in a voice that had the general shape of my own but wrong somehow, pitched a half step off, like a recording played at the slightly incorrect speed. I spun and saw nothing but scrub and rock in every direction, the kind of landscape that shouldn't hide a person within 20 yards, let alone close enough to speak like that. I didn't answer. Every instinct I had said not to answer. I got up and started walking, fast, back toward Marker 13, and the voice said my name again, from a different direction this time, still close, still wrong. I won't pretend I handled the next 20 minutes with any composure. I half ran, half stumbled along what I hoped was the trail, Marker 13 as my only anchor, and somewhere in that scramble, the ground underfoot changed, packed and trail-worn again, unmistakably, and Marker 12 appeared exactly where it should have been the entire time, as if it had simply been waiting for me to find the right version of the path. I didn't hear the voice again. I made it back to camp with maybe 20 minutes of light left, packed everything I could carry in the dark, and hiked out to the trailhead by moonlight and phone flashlight, rather than spend one more night there, arriving at my truck close to midnight, hands shaking too hard to get the key in smoothly on the first try. I checked the BLM website weeks later, partly to reassure myself, partly because I couldn't stop thinking about it. The trail markers were numbered 1 through 14, exactly as I remembered, but the site listed 13 official posts, not 14. Marker 12, the site noted, had been removed years earlier after repeated reports of hikers finding it in inconsistent locations, and had never been replaced. I planned this trip with more caution than usual. I'd read enough desert horror stories online, ironically, that I over-prepared. Joshua Tree backcountry, 5 days before my 30th birthday, and I'd stashed a water cache 2 miles from my campsite as insurance, the way experienced solo hikers do. I marked the GPS coordinates, photographed the burial spot next to a distinctive split boulder, and told myself I'd sleep better knowing it was there. I didn't expect to need it until day 3. I needed it on day 1. My primary water filter cracked on the second morning, some hairline fracture I hadn't caught during my pre-trip check, and by afternoon I'd rationed myself down to nothing. No panic yet, I had the cash. 2 miles was nothing. I set out with my GPS, confident, almost annoyed at the inconvenience rather than scared. I found the split boulder exactly where I'd photographed it. The cache was gone. Not disturbed. Gone. No dig marks, no animal tracks, no sign anything had clawed it up. Just smooth, undisturbed sand where I'd buried a sealed 5-gallon container 18 hours earlier. I checked my GPS coordinates twice, checked the photo on my phone to confirm the boulder's exact split pattern matched. It did. This was the spot. There was simply no water in it anymore. I want to explain the particular fear of this because it's different from other fears. It wasn't supernatural yet. In my head, it was just math. I had no water, 2 miles from camp. Camp had almost nothing either, and the trailhead was 9 miles beyond that. Fear turned practical fast, cold and clear. I hiked back to camp telling myself I'd misremembered the location, that tomorrow in better light I'd find the real spot, and this would resolve into an embarrassing story about my own carelessness. I rationed my last half-liter and forced myself to sleep. Around 1 a.m., I woke to the sound of digging. Steady, rhythmic, not far from my tent, the specific sound of a trowel or hands working into packed sand, pause, resume, like someone methodically excavating something. I lay still, telling myself it was a kit fox, a badger, anything with claws, and no intentions toward me. The digging continued for nearly 20 minutes before stopping abruptly. In the morning I found a hole outside my tent, roughly where I remembered burying a spare carabiner and some trail mix days earlier, for reasons I couldn't now explain to myself. Some habit from childhood, burying small things in new places, marking territory in a way that felt silly to admit. The trail mix was untouched, sitting exposed at the bottom of the hole. Only the carabiner was gone. I hiked to the cache site again that morning, and this time, in clear daylight, I found it. Not where I'd buried it, but 40 yards further out, sitting in the open, uncovered, lid off, completely empty, as though something had needed to see what was inside, rather than simply take it. I didn't drink from that cache, obviously, since it held nothing. I made the decision to hike straight out rather than trust my remaining supplies for 2 more days, and I want to be honest that dehydration alone can produce hallucinations, can make a person hear digging that isn't there, can make 9 miles feel like a fever dream, which it did. I stumbled into the trailhead parking lot late that afternoon, badly dehydrated, and a ranger who found me slumped by my truck got me water and asked what happened. I told him about the cache. He didn't seem surprised, just tired, and mentioned that backcountry caches in that district had a known problem with interference, his word, deliberately vague, and that the park had stopped recommending the practice 2 years back, after several hikers reported caches disturbed in ways that didn't match any animal behavior they could identify. He said it like a liability disclaimer, like something he'd said before and would say again. I never buried anything in that desert again, and I still don't bury small things out of habit, not since that hole outside my tent, sitting empty and exact, waiting for me to explain something I never could. I was 53, recently retired from 22 years as a high school biology teacher and camping alone in the Chihuahuan desert outside Big Bend because my late wife had always wanted to see it and I'd never made the trip while she was alive to see it with me. That's the whole reason I was there. I want that on record because I think grief changes what a person is willing to believe, and I'd rather you judge what happened knowing that going in. I chose a primitive site, accessible by a rough dirt road, checked in at the small ranger kiosk, and got directions to a spot with a good view east, the kind of place you'd want for sunrise. The ranger, a young woman who couldn't have been older than 25, mentioned there was a trail register a short walk from my site, an old wooden box on a post, mostly used by day hikers passing through. Standard stuff. I didn't think about it again until my second night. I'd been sleeping badly since Carol died. That's normal enough. Grief does that. And on this trip I'd taken to walking at odd hours when insomnia won, headlamp on, going nowhere in particular. Around 11 on the second night, my walk took me past the register box, and out of idle curiosity I opened it to see who else had come through. The most recent entry was mine, signed that morning. Below it were maybe 30 other entries going back 4 months. But as I flipped further back, I found an entry, dated 11 years earlier, signed with my own name, my full name, my actual signature. I'd recognize it anywhere, the particular way I looped the C, with a note beside it, "Here for Carol." She would have loved this. I had never been to Big Ben before. Not once, not 11 years ago, not ever. Carol had wanted to come for over a decade, and we simply never had time, and I remembered every detail of that period of our lives clearly enough to know I hadn't quietly taken a trip without telling her. I stood there in the dark for a long time, rereading it, checking the date against wedding anniversaries, against nothing that made sense, and could not explain it in any direction that let me put the register down and walk away untroubled. I went back to camp and didn't sleep. Artarshan around 2 a.m., I heard someone walking near my tent, unhurried, and for reasons I still can't fully account for, I said her name out loud into the dark, not calling out in fear, more like a question, the way you'd address someone you half recognized. The footsteps stopped. There was a long silence, and then, very quietly, from a distance that put whoever it was well outside my tent, a voice that had textures of hers, not identical, but close enough to stop my heart, said, "You came." I didn't respond. I couldn't. I lay rigid until first light, running through every rational explanation available to a retired science teacher: auditory pareidolia, grief-induced hallucination, some hiker with a similar voice calling to a companion, and none of them explained the register entry, which existed on paper, in ink, in my own handwriting, dated a decade before I'd ever set foot in that park. In the morning I went back to the box, needing to see the entry again in daylight, needing it to look less impossible than it had at midnight. The page was there. The entry was gone, not torn out, just absent, as though that portion of the page had simply never been written on, the paper smooth and unbroken where ink should have soaked in. I packed up and left a day early. At the ranger kiosk, the same young woman asked how my trip went, and I found I couldn't answer with anything but quiet, the same word I imagine every person who's experienced something like this reaches for, because it's true, and it explains nothing, and it closes the conversation. I haven't gone back. But I think about the entry sometimes. Not the voice, which frightens me less than I'd have expected, but the note. She would have loved this, because she would have. And some nights I wonder if grief opened a door I don't have a name for, or if the desert simply knew what I needed to hear, and offered it to me in the cheapest, cruelest coin it had. I'm a meteorology grad student, which is the only reason this story makes sense. I don't scare easily where the weather's concerned, because I understand it, or thought I did. I picked a remote stretch of the Mojave for a solo trip, specifically because the forecast was flawless. Clear skies, no wind advisories, a full week of stable high pressure. I chose the location partly for the isolation, and partly, I'll admit, because I wanted to photograph the Milky Way without light pollution, and this spot was as dark sky as anywhere in the continental US. The first night matched the forecast exactly. Still air, clear sky, temperatures dropping predictably as the sun went down. I got my photos, felt smug about my career choice, and slept well. The second night, at almost the exact same hour, the wind started. Not gradual, it started at full strength, all at once, a sustained gale that had no business existing under the high-pressure system I'd checked obsessively before leaving cell range. I know deserts can produce sudden localized winds, thermal effects, terrain funneling. I know the legitimate physics of it, and none of it matched what I was experiencing. This wind had a direction that made no sense against the terrain, blowing steadily from the one direction with nothing to funnel it, no canyon, no pass, just open, flat desert. My tent held, barely, and I lay there running through explanations, the scientist in me refusing to let go of the problem even as the rest of me wanted only for it to stop. It did stop, abruptly, at what my watch told me was exactly 2 a.m., cutting off mid-gust like someone had turned off a switch. The stillness afterward felt worse than the wind had. I told myself it was a fluke, some microclimate quirk I'd write up later as an interesting anecdote for my cohort. I almost believed that until the third night, when it happened again. Same time, same abrupt onset, same impossible directionality, and this time, underneath the wind, I heard something that took me longer than I'd like to admit to identify. My own voice, badly distorted, reciting the forecast I'd checked before leaving cell range, word for word, looping every few minutes like a recording caught in a stutter. I am not a person who believes in things without evidence, so I want to be clear that I spent a long time trying to explain this as some psychological effect of isolation and sleep deprivation, wind-induced auditory pattern matching, my own anxious brain manufacturing meaning out of noise. I still don't fully reject that explanation, but I also can't fully accept it, because at 2 a.m. exactly, the sound cut off mid-word, same as the wind had the night before, like both were controlled by the same hand on the same switch. On the fourth morning, I checked my equipment obsessively, looking for some prosaic cause, a malfunctioning weather radio, a recording app opened by accident, anything. Everything was off, exactly as I'd left it. My phone, which had no service and should have had no reason to show activity, had a single new voice memo in its files, 3 minutes long, time-stamped 1:58 a.m. that morning. I didn't remember recording it. I still haven't listened to it. It's still on my phone. I've started it twice and stopped within the first few seconds both times, unable to make myself hear whatever's on there. I broke camp that day, ahead of schedule, telling myself it was a change in the actual forecast, which technically it was. Real wind, real and predictable, moving in from the west. I drove out with the windows down despite the temperature, needing to feel real air on my face, air that behaved the way air was supposed to. I still study weather, I still go camping, though never alone since. And I still have that voice memo, unlistened to, because some part of me that trusts data over instinct in every other part of my life has decided, in this one case, that not knowing is safer than knowing, and I've never once second-guessed that decision. In the Badlands of Anza Borrego, silence is not an absence of sound, it is a pressurized density. An acoustic surveyor by trade, I have spent a decade measuring how sound reflects off drywall, limestone, and glass. When you enter a desert basin 20 miles past the last paved turnout, the ambient noise floor drops below 18 decibels. At that threshold, the human auditory system begins to fabricate its own baseline. You hear the fluid shifting in your inner ear. You hear the friction of your eyelids closing. I arrived at the dry wash near the sandstone cuts in late November. The sun was already bleeding into the Santa Rosa range, casting bruised purple shadows across the dry rifts. I wanted 4 days of absolute zero, no clients, no highway drone, no reminders of the civil negligence suit that had quietly unraveled my firm back in San Diego. I pitched my ultralight single-wall tent on a flat bench of compacted silt, 50 yards from the base of a jagged mudstone bluff. By 8 in the evening, the desert had drained itself of warmth. The temperature plunged 30 degrees within an hour. I sat on my ground pad inside the tent, boiling water over an isobutane burner, watching the blue flame hiss in the dark. That was when I heard the first cadence. It was faint, a dry, rhythmic scuffing against the caliche crust. Scritch, pause, scritch. I turned the burner valve until the flame died. The sudden dark was suffocating. I held my breath, resting my palm against the frozen ground to feel for vibration. Nothing, just the windless cold pressing against the nylon walls. I told myself it was thermal contraction, the silt beds cracking as they shed the day's heat. Rock does that under rapid cooling. It splinters with miniature rhythmic pops. I zipped my sleeping bag up to my chin and closed my eyes. But sleep in total isolation does not arrive as rest. It arrives as a hyper-vigilant trance. At 1:15 a.m., the sound returned. It was not the randomized snapping of cooling rock. It had cadence, spaced precisely 3 seconds apart, circling the perimeter of my guy lines. Scuff, drag, scuff. My heart hammered against my ribs, so loud I was terrified whatever was outside could hear it through the fabric. I kept my headlamp off, terrified that illuminating the tent would turn me into a glowing lantern, exposing my silhouette against the nylon. Slowly, moving only my forearm, I reached for the pocket knife in my pack. The sound stopped at the foot of my tent. For 10 minutes, there was nothing. Then, a low, drawn-out expulsion of air drifted through the mesh vents near the top peak. It smelled faintly of alkali dust and sour, stale moisture. It was not an animal's rapid panting. It was the deliberate, metered exhale of a pair of human lungs. "Who's out there?" I whispered. My voice sounded thin, pathetic, swallowed instantly by the vast canyon walls. No answer came, only the sound of feet slowly retreating toward the mudstone bluff, moving with unnatural slowness, as if the walker took care to distribute their weight so smoothly that not a single pebble tumbled down the wash. I did not sleep. I sat upright with my knees pulled against my chest until the sky through the triangular door turned the color of lead. When dawn broke, I unzipped the fly with trembling hands and stepped out onto the frozen silt. The ground around my tent was untouched. The pale, cracked mud showed no boot treads, no paw prints, no disturbed dust. For a brief moment, a wave of hollow relief washed over me. I tried to laugh, to convince myself that my exhausted, guilt-ridden mind had constructed an auditory phantom out of the desert's desolate silence. Then I looked at the tent's perimeter. At every point where a guy line met the ground, a small, smooth river stone had been set neatly on top of the aluminum stake. 6 stakes, 6 river stones. There were no riverbeds within 4 miles of that wash. Someone had stood over my tent in the dark, reached down without snapping a single cord, and balanced them with surgical precision, while I lay frozen inside. I didn't bother packing the stove or the sleeping mat. I ripped the stakes from the ground, stuffed the loose nylon into my trunk bag, and threw everything into the back of my truck. As I climbed into the cab and turned the key, my eyes caught a glint of movement 200 feet up on the ridgeline of the mud bluff. A figure was standing at the edge of the drop-off, motionless against the morning sun. It wasn't waving, retreating, or hiding. It was standing perfectly upright, hands down at its sides, staring down into the dry wash. Not at my running truck, but directly at the empty rectangle of dust where my tent had stood only minutes before. The Black Rock Desert in late spring is a dead sea of dry gypsum and sun-baked clay. As a landscape archivist, my job has always been the methodical documentation of terrain, recording erosion rates, sediment drift, and historical markers across federally owned expanses. I know how to prepare for the emptiness. I carry 40 liters of potable water, 2 satellite transmitters, and a self-standing geodesic dome tent rated for gale force winds. I had driven my modified 4x4 26 miles out onto the open playa, far past the northern tracks where weekend tourists occasionally wander. Out there, the horizon is a flat, unbroken pencil line separating white alkaline crust from bleached sky. There are no landmarks, no trees, no elevation changes, only endless scale. When you pitch a tent in the center of that plain, you are the single vertical interruption in 500 square miles of pure horizontal void. I set up camp 2 hours before twilight. The wind had dropped completely, leaving the air heavy, hot, and tasting of dry salt. Around 10 p.m., I stepped out to calibrate my handheld optical survey gear. In the high desert, darkness is absolute until your eyes adjust, turning the ground beneath your boots into a dim, ash-colored mirror of the starfield above. I pointed the laser rangefinder north toward the invisible boundary of the distant granite hills. The readout blinked. Out of range. I lowered the instrument and paused. About 300 yards due west, a pale point of light blinked on the playa. It was small, stationary, and faint, not the sweeping beam of a halogen flashlight or the amber blink of a truck's hazard lights. It was a cold, tiny filament of white light sitting completely flush against the ground. I picked up my binoculars and focused on the spot. Through the lenses, the light resolved into a clear, sharp puncture in the dark. It did not waver. It did not cast a beam upward into the sky. It sat directly on the mud floor, like an illuminated coin. For nearly 20 minutes, I stood beside my truck watching it. I told myself it was an automated meteorological sensor or a dropped surveyor beacon left behind months ago. Yet, as I stared, a subtle, disquieting sensation began to prickle along the back of my neck. The light was closer than it had been when I first noticed it. I lifted the optical rangefinder again and centered the crosshairs on the white point. 210 yards. My breath hitched. I lowered the scope, checked the ground at my feet, and raised it again. The playa is entirely flat. There is no gradient, no dip, no cover behind which a person could crawl unseen. Even under starlight, an object moving across the white floor casts a distinct silhouette. But between me and that pinprick of light, there was nothing. No movement, no shadow, no sound. 180 yards. A sudden sharp panic flared in my chest. I retreated inside the tent, zipped both internal storm flaps shut, and turned off every lamp. I sat on my aluminum stool, gripping my field logbook against my chest, listening to the vast, hollow vacuum outside. Every minute stretched like wet rubber. My heart felt heavy and erratic. There was no wind to ruffle the rainfly, no desert crickets, no distant hum of an interstate engine. Only the sound of my own shallow, ragged inhalations. Then came the vibration. It wasn't a sound. It traveled up through the 4 steel stakes anchored into the hardpan, vibrating directly into the tent floor and up through the soles of my boots. A deep, sub-audible hum, oscillating at an agonizingly low frequency, like a heavy generator idling 5 fathoms beneath solid rock. The tent fabric began to cast a faint shadow against my knees. I turned my head toward the western wall. The small, pure white light was illuminating the outside of the nylon. It had arrived at the outer vestibule. It was resting inches from the thin ripstop barrier, casting the crisp, sharp shadow of my camp stove against the tent's interior wall. I could not move. My muscles locked under a suffocating paralysis. I expected the nylon to rip, expected a silhouette to block out the light, expected a hand to drag across the exterior zipper. Instead, the light did not move. It simply grew hotter. Through the fabric, the faint smell of scorching salt and ozone began to seep inside. The temperature in the vestibule surged noticeably, a dry, baking heat radiating directly through the screen. For 2 hours, I sat frozen on my stool, watching that blinding, pencil-thin circle burn against the lower corner of the tent door, listening to the subsurface drone vibrate my marrow. Just before 4 a.m., the low-frequency humming cut out instantly. The light did not dim or retreat. It vanished in a microsecond, plunging the tent back into pitch blackness. I did not move until the pale gray wash of dawn lit the eastern ceiling. When I finally forced my stiff limbs to stand and pulled the zipper open, my knees gave out from exhaustion. Right outside the vestibule, exactly 18 inches from my tent door, was a perfectly circular hole in the alkaline hardpan. It was scarcely 3 inches wide, with edges so glassy and vitrified they looked melted. I dropped to my hands and knees and looked down into it. I pointed my high-lumen torch into the opening. The beam cut straight down into the smooth, cylindrical shaft, 5 feet, 10 feet, 20 feet. The light simply ran out of power before finding a bottom. I didn't pack the geodesic dome. I severed the tie-down lines with my pocket knife, threw my notebooks into the passenger seat of my truck, and slammed the accelerator into the south track. In my rearview mirror, the abandoned tent looked like a tiny, solitary speck on a flat, bleached ocean, a fragile shell left open beside an endless, unblinking pit.